Welcome to my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? With my guests, we are discussing reproductive health issues and debunking some of the many myths around our health. And in this series about embracing age, today it is a total pleasure to talk to Eleanor Mills about her new book and much more. And her book is called Much More to Come. Eleanor is the former editorial director of the Sunday Times and one of Britain's most high-profile commentators. In March 2021, she launched an online community platform for women called Noon. She began her journalistic life on The Guardian and Observer, and at the age of only 26, she was the Daily Telegraph's youngest ever features editor. During her long Fleet Street career, Eleanor was the Sunday Times' main interviewer. In 2014, she became chair of Women in Journalism, the industry's cross-media network for female hacks, and launched a series of high-profile events on media sexism and empowering women. Eleanor won the 2012 International Alliance of Women's World of Difference Award for her contribution to women's economic empowerment and was one of only 4 journalists in Europe to be shortlisted for Journalist of the Year at the European Diversity Awards in 2012. She appears regularly on television. You can catch her most weeks on ITV and on Sky News, reviewing the newspapers and commentating on politics and society. She has written 2 books, Cupcakes and Kalashnikovs, an anthology of the best journalism by women, and much more to come, and is currently working on a new book, Birds and the Bees 2.0, Talking Sex with Generation XXX. Welcome, Eleanor.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
So I always love starting my podcast by asking my guests what led them to the career that they're doing now. So please tell us more about your passion for being a journalist and an author.
Well, all my life I had wanted to write and also to tell different kinds of stories about women. I think that's been one of my real priorities. And when I left the Sunday Times after nearly 25 years, I had a really rude awakening. A lot of my friends were like, well, it was a real shock to be made redundant. And a lot of my friends were like, well, in the time that you've been working there, I've had like 10 different jobs and those, I was practically the last person standing who'd been in the same job for such a long time. But I think it was a real shock to the system because when you do something like that for so long, you become very institutionalized. And I really loved being a journalist, and I loved, partly because it gave me the power to go and look into things. I'm always incorrigibly nosy, but also because I felt that I wasn't a particularly typical Sunday Times journalist because I was always slightly to the left of the paper. And so I often got articles into the paper which I think wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for me, and particularly around women in war, around raising money for Britain's poorest children, that kind of thing. I've always had a bit of a social conscience. I come from a family of champagne socialists, really, if we're honest. But there's a real sense of kind of giving back, and that being a really important part of things. And that if you have a high profile and you have a role and you have the possibility to pay it forward or to do good, then you should always do that.
That's great. Now, you've been a journalist for over 25 years. So tell us a bit more about what it's been like.
Well, I think certainly when I started in newspapers, they were the most powerful gatekeepers, really, to culture. That if something was in the Sunday Times, you would, or the section of the Sunday Times I edited for 15 years was called the News Review section. And that was all about trying to make sense of what had been going on in the news and kind of asking bigger questions about what does this mean? What does this tell us about where we're going? And really back in the day, in the kind of 90s and the early 2000s, that really was the kind of creation of culture. It's probably hard for some people listening to this who are kind of have come of age kind of post social media. But before social media, if you wanted to speak to the main population, you had to go through gatekeepers. You had to do it through something like the Sunday Times or the BBC or other kinds of newspapers. And so we really were the centre of the culture, and you would really get a sense editing that section that sentences that we put out there in the world, you would hear repeated back to you over and over again. Politicians would use them on the Today programme. I mean, it became how the kind of almost like the matrix of how people thought. So it was a very exciting place to be, particularly as a young woman, where I think it would be fair to say there weren't too many female voices. I would quite often be the only woman in meetings, and often the youngest. So that was certainly, it was a very exciting place to be. I mean, there was definitely a sense of not being what they called missish, which meant, not making a fuss if somebody made some appallingly sexist remark, or, asked you, like, while you were down there, why didn't you, if your pen dropped on the floor, or, whatever. It was very sexist all the time. And you were kind of expected to suck that up as the price of being in the room. But it was also very heady and exciting to be allowed into the belly of the beast where all those decisions were being made. Certainly working for Rupert Murdoch was quite Succession, if you've seen that, in terms of really being allowed kind of, into sitting at supper with Rupert in New York, or being where those big decisions were being made, which were going to affect billions of people. And that was very exciting.
I can't imagine having dinner with Rupert Murdoch. Now, I want to talk about aging. This podcast series is called Embracing Age. And we've talked about aging before because I've interviewed you for my book. And we are part of a growing group of women over 50 who want to encourage positive aging. So I've asked you this for my book, but I want to ask you again, what is your view on aging?
Well, when I left the Sunday Times after 25 years and I was suddenly spat out, what I realised was that there was very little in the culture that was actually being actively directed at women 50 plus. And that there's a huge discrepancy between the financial clout that we have, women 50 plus, I call them queenagers, are behind over 90% of all household consumer spending decisions. And yet we appear in less than 10% of advertising. Forbes magazine calls us super consumers, and yet nothing in the culture is really directed at us. Basically because patriarchy values women for being fecund and young, young and hot, basically. And so there isn't much room within that male lens on the culture for women as they age. So when I left the Sunday Times, I became really interested in trying to create a new media space, and an online community for women 50 plus. And it's really interesting, if we think of the other media outlets that are directed at us, they're all called things like Good Housekeeping or Women in Home. I've worked every day since I left university. And I've never been a housekeeper, and I would never see myself as someone who's in charge of kind of keeping up the home. Actually, my husband's done a lot more of that than I have. So I think that there's really outdated thinking on what women 50 plus are like, what they want to read about, what they want to do, who they are. And so the platform I set up, which is called noon.org.uk, which is all about positive aging, as you talk about, and trying to tell a new and more positive story about queenagers and what we can do at this point. But also, what became very important to me was, because I was forced into this reinvention at 50, suddenly I lost this job which defined who I was for kind of 25 years of my adult life. I had to really kind of go back to the drawing board. And what I realised about that was that so many other women around me were having to do the same kind of reinvention. And yet there was no conversation or kind of map or signposts about that, and about this massive reinvention that so many of us hit at midlife at 50 or so. It just wasn't talked about. And we hear about kind of men running off with their secretaries or having a midlife crisis and kind of buying a red Ferrari. But I hadn't seen anything which was going, basically, whatever you've been doing between the ages of 25 and 50 will come to an end at about 50. If you've been raising kids, your kids leave home and, you're left with the empty nest. A lot of marriages break up at this point. A lot of us get bereaved, or our parents die, which kind of throws us into a new phase. We're seeing too many women being made redundant at 50 and being pushed out of the workforce. So for lots of different reasons, and the research that we did on my platform kind of really backed up that hunch. We found that by 50, over half of women have been through at least 5 massive life events: divorce, bereavement, redundancy, the caring for elderly parents. Often women at this stage are also caring, because they've had children later, are caring for a young person with quite complicated mental health challenges. I can see you nodding there. I mean, we see that so often in our work. And then not to mention their own health stuff and a bit of menopause and, empty nest and all those kind of things too. So there's a big sense that there is a shift that comes at about 50. We just don't talk about it very much. But I'm also interested in, as we live longer, and the real longevity dividend is being felt by our generation. So I was born in 1970. Women of my cohort are quite likely to live till we're 95 or 100. And in the 100-year life, I think we need to really radically rethink the different stages of our lives. No one can expect anymore that they'll kind of get educated and then work for the same company and then retire. Because if we're all going to live that long, it's really, and work's becoming much more insecure. But so the idea that you would kind of get educated and then do one thing and then retire and die is just not how it works anymore. So I'm interested in a different kind of model for our lives, which for me goes something like 0 to 25 is about kind of grow. You get educated, you get out there in the world. 25 to 50, I think of as the years of achievement. It's where we're kind of ticking all the boxes that our parents or our cultures or our, everything that we're told that we're supposed to do. So that might be getting a job, getting a career, having some kids, finding somewhere to live, all those kind of normal things. But I think what that gives us is that at 50, this bit between 50 and 75, is the bonus. It's the kind of, it's the bonus bit, isn't it? Where we're still, if we're lucky, we've got health span and lifespan, and a lot of women have worked all the way through, so they've got a bit of money. And so we have actually got a possibility here of some reinvention or doing some things for ourselves. So I see that bit between 50 and 75 as the age of becoming. And for me, it's when we, particularly for women, we really get to become the people that we always wanted to be. And I talk to so many women who go, oh, well, when I set off in my 20s, I wanted to write a book, or I wanted to climb a mountain, or I wanted to, all these kind of early dreams that we had, which life gets in the way of. And what I see with my incredible community of Queenagers is so many women actually going back to those dreams at 50, because there's a bit of a sense of, if not now, when? And I also think that there are big psychological shifts that happen for us at this point. We finally shed a lot of that kind of the story from our birth family and their expectations and their values, and we're finally free to really kind of, I talk a lot about shape-shifting, and the shape-shifting we do in midlife in my book. And I feel that at 50 we're finally able to kind of pour ourselves into the shape that we might have taken organically, rather than being pushed into the kind of jigsaw puzzle piece that society or our families or our kind of, our own self-limiting beliefs pushed us into at that time. Because often we assume a position which gets us affection, which makes us belong, and that often that's a kind of sensible thing to do for ourselves in terms of survival, but we don't necessarily need to take that shape for the whole of our lives. And one of the great things about the 100-year life is that we can shift into different phases. So what I see at noon, and I called it noon because in the 100-year life, 50 is only halfway through. So we're only at lunchtime, as it were, in the day. And I wanted to create a new map, a new kind of set of signposts, a new kind of sense of possibilities for women at this point about what could be possible. And my real ambition is to make, I've got daughters who are 19 and 22. I want them to look forward to being Queenagers as when it all gets good.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the women I've interviewed, I know they're a select group, and I think we're probably seeing the biased part of the population. Certainly not all women are like this, and you and I and others, we really need to help them. But they do feel they're finally needing their authentic life. That was a word that came up a lot. Now Queenagers, can you explain what you've got a great, you talk about in your book about how you invented the term Queenager. So sort of break it down for us.
Well, we did a big piece of research, which was sponsored by Accenture at noon, because we do quite a lot of consulting about kind of what women want from work and that kind of thing. And one of the things that we really found on that was, we did a focus group, and one of the women said to me, I feel like a teenager, but in my own home with posh sheets and nice tea. And that really stuck in my mind, the sense that this was yet like another kind of teenagehood, a kind of middle kind of adolescence, where we're shifting from having been one kind of person into something else. And of course, there's a bit of a kind of hormonal shift and all that kind of thing. So I had this sense in my head of us being kind of teenagers again at this point. And then I spent a lot of time in Jamaica. I love it out there. And there, older women are seen in a very different way from how they are in the UK. A lot of the families are quite matriarchal. The women have often, brought everybody up. So they're accorded a lot more respect. And I was playing pickleball one day in Treasure Beach in Jamaica with some friends and some Queenager friends. And a whole load of boys were playing, or youths were playing football right next to us. And one of the Queenagers turned around and said to them very gently, "Look, would you mind playing at the other end of the football pitch so you're not kicking your ball onto our tennis court all the time?" And they immediately did what she said. And I thought, wow, in London, I don't know whether as a 50-year-old woman, if I turned around and asked like 40 youths to play somewhere else, they would have done what I said. I think the likelihood is definitely not. So I really like that sense of the kind of authority, the kind of regalness that the older women in that society have. And they're often referred to as queens. So in my head, it kind of came together. So I got the kind of the teenagers and the Queenagers. I've been writing headlines for a very long time. So we came up with the idea of the Queenager, which for me I think is important because we desperately needed a bit of a rebrand. And other women might want to embrace being a crone or a hag, but I have to say that doesn't really do it for me. And I quite like being a Queenager. I think we're midlife queens hitting our stride. What's not to like? And I think it gets a bit of a sense of kind of coming into this really kind of golden time, which I really think it is.
Yeah, crone and hag are a little bit negative. Now, you write a newsletter which is in one of the top 10% read globally. What are the main topics women want to read about?
Well, I write a newsletter every week called The Queenager. If you'd like to sign up to it, go to noon.org.uk and you can sign up to it there. I suppose having been a columnist for such a long time, old habits die hard. But what I really loved, it started off on Substack and now it actually comes from the Noon website. But what I really love about writing that is that for so long as a journalist, even though I was very senior and quite powerful within the Sunday Times, everything I wrote had to go through a kind of succession of more senior men. And therefore there was quite a limited repertoire of stuff that you could write about. And you certainly couldn't write about things like how the media operated or how it was kind of biased against women or how it had a kind of, a very male lens on what women were for. So just to explain to people what I mean by the male lens, in newspapers, I think the most egregious example I ever came across was Nicola Sturgeon went to meet Theresa May to talk about Brexit when they were both the heads of their particular governments. And the headline in one of the tabloids the next day was, "Forget about Brexit, it's all about Legxit." It was on the cover of the Daily Mail with a picture of both women and their legs, and so it was a really clear case of, so the male lenses, it doesn't matter how successful you are, as a female leader, you're always going to be judged on the sexiness of your legs rather than the kind of the content of your job or your character or your beliefs or your principles. And that basically is kind of quite a shorthand, I think, for how the media operates. It sees women, as an old picture editor once said to me, brighten up the page, love, which meant putting a picture of a pretty girl. And if you think, it's not that long ago since women were draped over the bonnets of cars or kind of, handed out as like extra fruit baskets with various different kind of commodities. So I think the media is still quite imbued with that, particularly marketing and advertising and that kind of thing, which still, I mean, if you think about the women that you're allowed to see on your screens, they aren't the older women don't usually look like the older women that you know. I think that would be a polite way of putting it. And they're very screened out for particular kinds of qualities. And what we found in our Noon research, to your point about authenticity, was that Queenagers would be over 55% more likely to buy from a brand that represented them authentically, and yet hardly any of them do. So I think that there's just such a massive kind of myopia, a kind of total blindness about the fact that there's this whole cohort of women feeling quite good about themselves at kind of 50 plus, doing some incredible things, that we're a really pioneering generation. there haven't been women like us before at this point. We really are like the first ones in history to have got to 50 with so much kind of health and possibility and life ahead of us. And that the world hasn't really caught up with who we are, what we want, how we might like to be treated, what we need for our lives to flourish. So just as I think our generation has been at the kind of tip of the spear in work, in terms of like arguing for maternity leave or for flexible working or for shared parental leave, all those things that came in very much during our lifetime. So the kind of next bit of the feminist jigsaw puzzle for me is valuing women as they age, because that really challenges patriarchy, because it's like we're now no longer useful to the male lens, to the kind of male system, unless we're grandmothers. And since 30% of queenagers aren't mothers, they're not going to be grandmothers. So that immediately kind of takes out a whole huge chunk of the population. And so I think we really, really need a new story about what women are for as they get older, and what they expect and what they can do and who they are and what they look like and what their attitudes are, because the current myths in our culture are so out of date.
Yeah, totally agree. And let's delve a little bit more now into your latest book, much more to come. And there's so many gems there. You've covered some of those already. One of the things was about women finding their tribe, which I think is so important. I just think women being together, finding their tribe, fabulous. Do you want to say a bit more about women finding their tribe?
Yeah, well, everything we do at Noon really is about that. So when I first set Noon up, I mean, it's quite funny to think now, it's 3 years ago, and I set out with my computer. I had a laptop, and I started writing my newsletter, and I invited some of the women who were reading the newsletter to come to what I called a Noon circle, at a flat of a friend of mine in Soho. And it was a complete random punt. I thought maybe no one will show up, but they did show up, and they went on showing up every month. And we've created this we've now got 12 around the UK, 3 in America, and we're creating a movement which is really about the incredible power and alchemy that happens when you get a room full of women together. Because I think why it's so important for queenagers is partly because there isn't really any story out there which matches what's going on in our lives. So the women sit around the circle, and they all feel their own individual sense of kind of lack. They feel that they individually are a bit useless, or haven't made a good fist of it, or that they're the only one who's just got divorced, or their kids have left the nest and they're really finding them feeling really sad, or they've just been made redundant and they feel like they're on the scrap heap. And what happens when you go around the Noon circle, we have about 20 women there, is that slowly the penny begins to drop, that absolutely every woman in that room has gone through some form of what I call the midlife clusterfuck, which is when a whole load of these things hit together and your life really goes off the rails. And I suppose what I realized through it happening to me was just how kind of prevalent it was. And when I started writing about it and talking about it and getting these women together to talk about it, and what I see is so strong is that they begin to realize that it's something systemic, that this isn't about them individually and them being crap. It's about a shift going on in women's lives. It's about patriarchy. It's about gendered ageism and how older women are seen. And all these things that we felt insulated from, or felt were never going to happen to us, suddenly hit. And they make us feel really bad about ourselves. And suddenly realizing that everybody else is in it too makes you stop feeling like individually responsible and a bit useless, and start feeling a bit angry, or a bit like, oh, hang on a sec, it's not just me. So if all these other amazing women are going through it too, maybe there is a future for me after all. And also what we see is, now I've been doing it for 3 years, I see women go through this kind of midlife collision, this kind of bit of shedding where everything falls away and you feel like you're done and your life as you knew it is over. But then what's wonderful, and what we see in the research as well, is that the women who've been through the most and who shed the most at this point end up the happiest. So you get this wonderful kind of circle, I suppose, and you begin to see in the circles themselves of women who say, they have first come because their husband's just left them and they're in a terrible state, or somebody's died, or they've just lost a job. And then as the months and years pass, you suddenly see them move into this wonderful new chapter. they go back and they study, or maybe they meet somebody else, or they go traveling, or they set up a new business, or it's so incredible the things that I've seen unfold in that circle, and how people have gone from being so unhappy to happier than they've ever been in their lives. And they say, why doesn't and so I suppose what we're trying to do there is show what the route through it can be, that yes, you're not on your own when you go through your midlife clusterfuck, and that as you come out of it, there are all these possibilities. And in fact, I was just speaking to a woman before I came on this call who'd been made redundant. She'd been at a retreat that I ran a couple of weeks ago, and she said, wow, I know from having sat in the circle listening to all those women's stories of how they've reinvented and what they've done, that there are so many different ways through this. And she actually felt really excited about what she might now be allowed to do. And I think particularly for a generation of women who very much, a lot of us, defined ourselves through our work kind of for the first time. There are some who've kind of been doing kids for a long time who really want to power up their careers. There are others who have been doing something for a long time and really want to do something else, and people who want to be more creative. And I also see a lot of women, particularly those who don't have kids, feeling very passionate about leaving some kind of a legacy. Whatever that might look like. So they're setting up charities, or they're kind of, really working for causes that they feel will make a difference. So that shift into purpose for women at this point is really key. And we see that in the research that we did. So shift into purpose, and this sense, very strong sense amongst the women, over half agree with the statement that this is finally when it becomes about me. It's finally my turn. I've spent the last 25 years looking after everybody else, and this is when I get to do something for me.
Yeah, and obviously, as you said, the tribe's important, but in your book you talk in more depth about women needing to invest in ourselves. So I think that's a really good way to put it. Anything else you want to say about that, investing in ourselves?
I think for too many women, we come bottom on our to-do list always. The things that we need to do for ourselves, or that, are just about what makes us feel good or brings a bit of joy into our own lives, or even if it's our own physical health. I think women are really bad about prioritizing themselves. We see that in their finances. For instance, women have a pension gap with men. They retire with 35% less money than men do, and that's often, I think, because we prioritize, having to pay the childminder, or having to pay for the music lessons or the ballet lessons, or for packed lunches or something, above our own financial future. So I think that there's a real, and I think also, and I write about this a lot in the book, unpicking the programming which made us like we were, and what a lot of the ideas were, all the things that we were told as we were growing up. So, for instance, I went back and looked at old Brownie and Girl Guide manuals. And what was terrifying about that was how they were all about women basically being hostesses, our whole job being to serve kind of other people. Girl guides in the 1980s are being kind of told how to make your husband a drink when he gets back from work, and how to make yourself a nice salad so you'll stay nice and thin and attractive for him. I mean, it's really shocking. Talking about being groomed by patriarchy, it's really there in black and white. And if we think about somebody like Princess Diana, who got, Princess Diana was married to Prince Charles, I think, when I was 12. So that was a very formative moment for our generation. Here was this princess, the kind of acme of what femininity was meant to be about. And she said very publicly, when she first got engaged to Prince Charles, all I want to be is a good wife and mother. So I think that there's a huge amount of baggage that we carry as queenagers. We're very much a pivot generation between our mothers, who, born in the 1940s or kind of earlier, grew up in the kind of 50s. So, okay, some of them may have worked, but the majority had quite traditional lives. And we're this generation that were told right from the beginning that we could have it all. We could have a job, and we could have a family, and all the rest of it. And we've been kind of muddling through, and often that's been kind of, quite exhausting. So I think that in all of that, our own needs were always meant to be subjugated to everybody else's, whether that was a boss's at work or family at home. And so what I see the queenagers doing is finally going, oh, hang on a second, what am I going to do with this one wild and precious life of mine? I've been working all this stuff, I've been looking after the kids, I've been doing everything for everyone else. But who am I, and what does my own self-fulfillment look like? And that maybe at 50, you're finally allowed to do a bit of that for yourself. And seeing the women come to that kind of conclusion, and then what they can do with that amazing bit of life that they've been gifted, which we really have. We should be being really, really excited about it, not feeling bad about getting kind of, wrinkly or, kind of not looking like we're supposed to according to some ridiculous thing in the media because we've got kind of cankles or bingo wings or some ridiculous misogynistic kind of bit of self-flagellation that we've all been taught to imbibe. So I'm trying to kind of get women to see themselves as they really are without all the crap that the media has been pumping at them basically for the last 40 years.
Yeah, we have been pumped a lot of crap. And in your book, one of the most important things I got from it was exactly what you said about pensions and finance, which is certainly one of the things that I really failed at. I have got a great pension. I've been obviously an academic for a long, long time. But bringing up 3 kids on my own for the last 12 years has been a bit of a disaster financially, and I've realised I'm never going to pay off my mortgage. It's just not going to happen. I'm going to have to downsize at some point and release some money. So, what extra advice would you give to women about their pensions and finance?
Well, we do quite a lot of this at Noon, actually. We've done quite a few partnerships with different kind of banks around pensions and that kind of thing. So I think the first thing is and I've also delved quite a lot into women's attitudes to this. So the first thing is to remind yourself that a man is not a financial plan, which I think a lot of us were brought up with. And also, if we find this a bit hard, to remind ourselves that it was only in 1975 that women were allowed to have their own bank accounts and to own a house without having to own it with a man. So a lot of this stuff is really quite recent, and one of the things that I think women get really gaslighted about right now is that we've got equality. We haven't got equality at all. We're in the absolute foothills of the whole kind of struggle for gender equality, I think. And when you think that something as basic as having your own bank account was only a given for women in 1975, and that's when the Equal Pay Act comes in, and it's less than 100 years since women were allowed to vote in the UK. So all the things that we think of as being kind of women's rights are actually very, very new, and as we know, can be pushed back on. I mean, we may be getting a Trump presidency next week, or we might get Kamala Harris, and that's a really massive moment, I think, for women globally. But I think that there's a real thing here around women taking responsibility for their own finances, not being an ostrich about it. I'm definitely guilty of finding it a mixture of kind of terrifying and boring, which is a pretty paralyzing combination, but also taking heart in the fact that if you really get a grip on it. So the first thing to do is, if you've had lots of different jobs, where are your different pensions held? Where are all those pots? And you can go to the government's pension thing or to someone like AJ Bell, and they'll do a pensions calculator for you and bring all your pensions together in one pot. And I think that that's quite good, because then you can look at it and you'll actually know how much your pension's worth, how much money you're going to have to live on. And if that is a bit horrifying, it's not too late to do something about it. We're all going to live quite a long time. So if you start saving now, that can still help. And I think really knowing what Baroness Helena Morrissey, who's on my Noon board and real expert on personal finance, says is it's a bit like anything that we do, little and often is what we need to be doing. So we just need to be kind of taking a look at our bank accounts or our pensions, or making a few investments a bit and getting our heads around it, because we're clever ladies, we can do that, and not thinking that there's some knight on a kind of big white horse is going to come up and sweep in and make everything okay, because that's just not going to happen. And the problem with the pension gap is women live longer than men. So if we're not going to live in penury in our old age, we really need to get a grip on the money. And the other really important thing is, if you're getting divorced, don't ask for the family house, ask for the pensions, or certainly get your share of the pension, because that's often where a lot of assets are kept, and yet most women don't know anything about it. And if you have a job and you're offered a pay rise, always ask for an increase in the amount of money being put into your pension as well. Basic things that we were just never told.
That's such sound advice, and you'll be very proud of me. I phoned UCL Pensions last week, had a chat with a lovely woman, told me things I never knew I was entitled to. So please don't be scared. Eleanor's given you some great advice there. Just do it. Get someone to advise you and look after your finances for sure.
Yeah, but
now we both have our So,
There you go. No, it sounds so basic, doesn't it? Just to kind of know where you are, but so many women don't, and they are kind of scared of it, and they don't, and they don't do it. But I think so. If you're going to do one good thing for yourself, really get your money in order. Knowledge is power.
that's great, great advice. Definitely don't be scared. It's fine. They're not going to bite you. Now, you mentioned your two daughters. I've got sons, and all of our kids recently have left for university, and we've had a discussion about empty nest. So, how do you feel about having an empty nest?
Well, I was so sad when they both went to university. I've written about it. I wrote about it in the book, and I can remember like walking into my daughter's room after she'd gone and literally sitting on her bed, kind of sobbing and that kind of thing. And so that grief is very real. That transition from out of the kind of everydayness of parenting, kind of, I don't know, running them bars, making them food, just them being around and being responsible for them all the time. When that suddenly shifts and they go off to university or they go off to live their own lives, that's a massive shift. And I think in some ways it's as big a shift as when you become a parent in the first place. So I think more conversation about that and understanding the grief around that, I think, is really important. But what I've also learned is that they come back a lot, and that there are there's some quite good sweet payoffs to them not being around all the time. I've been with my husband for nearly 30 years, and it feels a bit like we're back in that bit which we were in before we had the girls. We had 7 years together before they came along, and part of the reason we're still married and we're still together is we like hanging out together, and we actually have a lot more time to be together and do things, and we have quite a lot of fun. Whisper it, the children don't like that. We go to gigs and we kind of do a bit more traveling and that kind of thing. So I mean, I think that there are upsides, and no one really talks about the upsides in terms of if you've had a long-term partner, that you get a bit more time together. It doesn't have to be that kind of old cliche of staring each other across the breakfast table and going, "What? It's just me and you now for the next 30 years." Although that is true for some women, and I see a lot of women in the noon circles who are getting divorced, or who've had affairs themselves, or whose husbands have, and that, I have to say, looks like a car crash. Although there are also lots of really positive stories of people meeting new partners, or building a good life on their own. About 40% of women 55 plus are living on their own. So again, that's something that we don't really think about in the culture. So one of the things I'm really interested in is just telling a different story, and a more realistic story about the true nature of lives of women as we age. What empty nest is really about. What it's actually like to be married for a very long time, or how 30% of university educated women 45 plus don't have kids, or how over half of women at this point are the main breadwinner in their family. I mean, there are just so many things that when you say to people, they go, "Oh, really?" Or that we've got we outspend millennials by 250%, women at this point. So there's so many things that we are that are not being recognised. And I think partly because I was a journalist for a long time, I can see where the holes are in the culture and what stories need to be told, so that we women at this point don't feel like we're some kind of weird, freaky kind of outliers, because we're not.
Yeah, good advice. Now, you and I are both quite obsessed with cold water swimming, and I'm actually recording this from Turkey, and I've just been in the sea, and it's really warm. It's about 24, and before we came on, we were talking about how we love the cold water, but more than the hot water. So, why do you love cold water swimming?
Well, as you know from reading my book, so the book's called Much More to Come, and on the front of it is a kingfisher. Because when I go swimming in the ladies' pond on Hampstead Heath, which I do every day, in fact, I haven't been today because I went to a qigong class. Sorry, I'm such a dreadful North London cliche. But on the cover of my book is a picture of the kingfisher, which I often see in the pond. And one of the things that I started doing when I left the Sunday Times, and is actually something that I suggest to the women who come to my things a lot, that they do, is to really remember what it was that you really loved doing when you were a kid. And for me, the things that have always reliably brought me joy in my life are getting into water. I see myself as a bit like an otter. I never falter when I'm getting into water. And reading. So what saved my life when I left the Sunday Times was writing this book and, going back to writing and reading, which has always been one of my real passions, and swimming every day in the pond in Hampstead Heath, because that, for me, that's just like a jolt into the present. It's kind of saying whatever else is going on, however crazy your mind's going, or however busy you are, that's just a moment where you are entirely present in the kind of the shock of the cold of getting into the water, of seeing the ducks, of seeing the trees, seeing the way the sun falls on the ripples of the water. And for me, it's become a really magical moment of resetting every day. And I've also, I think, become really addicted to that kind of bit of being in nature. I noticed the way the trees have changed since the day before, or that the ducks are a bit noisy, or yesterday there was a whole explosion of parakeets that came out of a tree where I was, just as I was swimming around. So you notice the kind of minutiae of the changing seasons, and of the kind of wildlife, and of the people. It's a wonderful community. So for me, that daily trip to the pond has become almost like a symbol of my new life, and of living in a more authentic way, which brings me more kind of true joy. And I also think it's really good for our health. I feel better if I've been in the water, and kind of it's very good for your kind of brown fat and for your heart, and all sorts of different things. And I think you just generally feel a lot more cheerful if you do it.
I agree. Beautifully put. Now, can you tell us about the book you're working on now?
Yeah, I think that biography you read out at the beginning for me is one which I haven't used for a while, but I have been working on a book for quite a while about pornography and teenagers, because it's one of the things that, as a journalist, I wrote about. I was one of the first journalists to write about the effect of internet pornography on teenagers back in 2012. It was a really long time ago, and I ran some of the first kind of campaigns around the effect of it. And the reason I became interested in it was I had an 8-year-old at the time. I was outside the school gates, and one of the mothers came up to me completely distraught because they'd been doing some homework on the computer, and the kid had clicked on a picture of the moon, which went through to a pornographic website of a whole load of people having group sex. And the child was so traumatized by what they'd seen, and the mum couldn't really, they just didn't have the kid just didn't have any kind of context for what they were seeing. The mum was completely freaked out. And I thought, wow, if that's just one case of a kind of click through to something which they shouldn't have seen, what effect is this stuff having on kids? And I started being interested in that. And I'm absolutely horrified to say it was one of those things. So I wrote an article, really early article, called Generation Triple X for the Sunday Times Magazine, which was about the very first kids who were growing up with internet pornography, and how different that was from just looking at kind of girly mags, in your father's shed or something. That the fact that it was film rather than still images was much more intense. And also I became very interested in the psychology around how one's sexual stimuli are set by those first erotic experiences. So, it's one thing maybe to see a kind of a flash of a bit of lace panty or kind of an ankle or something, but it's quite different if what the content that you're seeing as like a 12, 13-year-old boy is really extreme. I kind of came up with this idea, which I think has proved to be true, that we were setting a whole generation's sexual dial to kind of extreme before they'd even got anywhere near a real girl. And then because I've had teenage daughters through this whole time, I've talked to them a lot, and I go into schools and talk about the effect of porn a lot, on the girls and on the boys, on what they think is normal now in terms of sexual acts. So I've run an informal kind of book of all the kids who've come through my house, which I have to say is hundreds, because I live around the corner from Camden School for Girls, where my kids went. So our house has always been like an informal sixth form common room. But I asked all the girls if they'd been choked by a boy when they were kind of what they're called getting with, which is what we used to call getting off with someone or snogging someone. They now think it's as normal for a boy to try and choke them while they're having a kiss as we would have thought it was for someone to put their hand on our ass or on our tits or something. They think it's completely normal to be throttled. And that comes from pornography. And then the
Lots.
other thing, which of course is completely porn related, is that they all have shaved pubic hair, like really extremely shaved
Yeah.
pubic hair. And again, that's a pornified norm. So just from those two things, and not to mention, I mean, I won't go into it because it's too disgusting, but the kind of spitting and kind of a lot of things which never happened to us when we were growing up are now completely, like, base one for young women because of the porn the boys have been consuming. And the problem is that the boys see the porn, that's what they think sex is, that's what they want, it's what the girls think that they should be doing. So we've basically turned a whole generation into, I mean, what they think sex is compared to what we thought sex was is completely different. And I'm afraid for a lot of women it's not about their pleasure. It's extremely painful, it's really degrading, and it's pretty horrible. And it feels to me massively depressing that in 2024 a whole generation of young women have been groomed to kind of have a whole load of sex which before we would have seen was absolutely extreme, only kind of porn stars or maybe people in a few Soho sex clubs would have been doing. And I'm really not a prude about this kind of stuff, but I just don't think that sex should be something which is scary and painful for the majority of women, which porn influenced sex is. I used to go into schools with a guy who used to edit Loaded, and he used to talk about how he was not the most PC of men. He kind of used to talk about how, as editor of Loaded, he'd seen 1,000 pairs of tits before kind of lunch. That's my old kind of journalistic background coming through. But he used to say to the kids that a good man never hurts a woman during sex. And he used to say that because his own father had grown up in a mining village and had said to him when he was a kid, a good man never hits his wife because there'd be so much kind of violence going on within those relationships. And he was then updating it for the next generation, which is to say, a good man doesn't hurt a woman during sex. But the very fact that that needed to be said so explicitly, I think tells you a lot about what's going on in the kind of sexual culture in our schools. I mean, there's a lot of evidence now that that's true, and massive NSPCC report, huge Ofsted report on the kind of pornified, world that kids are growing up in. Endless teachers being subjected to kind of AI porn, girls at school. Just, I mean, the levels of kind of graphic sexual abuse and the things that they're shown and expected to do. I just think it's absolutely horrendous. And the problem, as we know, with misogyny is that it doesn't go away, it mutates. So while we've all been talking about kind of women's equality and getting women on board, what's really been happening to our young daughters is a really horrible kind of throwback in terms of the sexual culture they're experiencing and the attitudes of young men towards women, which we're seeing with boys liking Andrew Tate, or there's been a whole load of interesting polling recently showing that young men are becoming much more right-wing and women are becoming much more liberal. And again, that comes from that kind of pornified sense of what a man is.
I don't know how many times I've said to my boys, porn is not real, and gone through everything that you said. It's I feel I have to keep saying it to them again and again.
No, well, you do.
Now,
And
Eleanor, I've called this podcast.
Sorry, I want to say something that's really important. That I think it's really important that
Yeah.
grown-ups, adults, say to children that sex is not porn, and learning about sex from porn is like learning to drive by watching The Fast and the Furious, say, and that we have a responsibility as their parents to talk about what it was like for us and the kinds of things that were really not on the menu and that maybe they shouldn't really be thinking about, or that aren't something that they should be asking a real person to do. And I think particularly mums of boys and mums of girls too, because I think when you say to the girls this was not something that we were expected to do 30 years ago, they suddenly go a bit like, oh, okay, hang on, maybe this is a bit weird.
Yeah, I'm with you there for sure. Now, Eleanor, I've called this podcast "Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This?" Now, you've spoken to so many women over your life and career. So, have you ever had that comment? Why didn't anyone tell me this? And what did they ask?
Well, the thing that I talk to women about most where they say that to me is when I say that no job will ever love you back, and that it doesn't matter kind of, how much you've prioritized the job, or you think it's more important than anything else in your own life, or whatever you've done, however loyal, however good an employee you've been, at some point there will come a day when you're just a number on a spreadsheet and your face doesn't fit anymore and you'll be out. So what I say to people is, I don't think you should be particularly loyal to an employer, because they're never loyal to you, whatever they say. And particularly these kind of companies which pretend that they'll do your dry cleaning for you and they really care for you and you're part of the family. That is complete rubbish. So my thing is to everyone, and women particularly, is have a side hustle. Always think about what you would do if you didn't have that job, and kind of always have something that you're kind of, you're a bit like a DJ mixing in a record, a kind of another track that you could bring in if necessary, and never put too many of your career eggs in one basket. I mean, for me, I was saved by the fact that I'd spent 7 years running women in journalism, which I'd done because it was something that I really cared about. But actually, when I left the Sunday Times, all of that work, which was the work that I'd done, as myself, I was never paid for it, but I did it because I really cared about it. That became the route into kind of my next definition, my next chapter, my next kind of part of myself. And that network of women that I'd helped and people that I'd helped and things that I'd done was actually much more important to me than anything from the actual job. So I'm always thinking about, what are your side hustles, or what are the things that you really care about? A very wise businesswoman once said to me, your kind of what you really have, your kind of transferable kind of kit, as it were, is everything you'd have if you walked out of your job tomorrow, without your contacts book or whatever, because often you can't even take any of that with you. So it's just thinking, not putting too many eggs in the work basket, I think.
Eleanor, you have such amazing advice for women. It's really brilliant. Now, just to finish off, some questions about you. So, Eleanor, what makes you happy, and where is your happy place?
Well, one of my happy places is definitely the ladies' pond on Hampstead Heath, and getting in the water always makes me happy. And the other thing that really makes me happy, in fact, I was talking about someone about this yesterday, is sitting in the circle with my incredible Queenagers and hearing their stories, and also realising how much Noon has helped them, and feeling very purposeful about what I'm trying to do now. I think that pivot into purpose and finding something where we can really make a difference is a really important part of being a Queenager. And also that the only people we're really indispensable to is our family. So, always prioritize that. I really love my daughters and my husband and my wider family. And as I get older, they bring me, more and more joy. I really want to be a granny, actually. Maybe not quite yet, but I would love to be a granny.
Not yet, for sure. You're not the only one I've said to, and the kids have gone to you. Not yet. Don't be a granny yet. Give them some time. Give you some time. And the last question. I did ask you this for the book, but I'm going to ask you again. What advice would you give your younger self?
Oh, right. What advice I would give my younger self is try and enjoy it. Enjoy the journey. Remember that it's, enjoying the kind of everyday that matters, not the kind of bauble at the end of it. And also, if you're really having a terrible time somewhere, or you've got a bad boss, leave. Definitely. Life's too short.
Life is too short. Well, Eleanor, that's been absolutely fantastic. You honestly are such a life force, and you've got so much information and great advice to share with people. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, and for the interview for my book, and for writing your books. And please continue with Noon. It was just amazing. So thank you for being my guest.
Thanks very much for having me.